I still remember the first time I realized that silence could carry weight, could speak louder than even the angriest scream. I was barely 7, maybe 8, living in a small suburban town where the lawns were manicured and the streets smelled faintly of gasoline and freshly cut grass. My parents weren't the kind to shout or raise their voices too often, but they had rules, and they had lessons that, in hindsight, shaped me far more than any playground game or school assignment ever could. One summer evening, after dinner, my parents brought home a small, scrappy dog from the local shelter. Its fur was a tangled mess of browns and greys, and its eyes were bright, filled with curiosity and anxiety at the same time. They told me he needed a name. I suggested Max. They agreed, and Max became mine in an instant, though he wasn't quite mine in the way you think. He was stubborn, full of energy, and had a tendency to bark at everything: the mailman, the cat next door, the wind itself, if it rustled through the trees. My parents sat me down that night and explained something that sounded almost ridiculous to my young ears. When Max barks to get your attention, the best thing you can do is ignore him. Don't feed into the noise. Don't reward the yelling. Wait until he calms down and then give him what he needs. I didn't fully understand, of course. Dogs were supposed to respond to commands. But my parents' eyes were serious. They were teaching me patience, discipline, and, strangely enough, the power of silence. At first it felt unnatural. I tried yelling back at Max when he barked at me. Stop, sit, be quiet. But he didn't listen. The more I reacted, the louder he became. And then, almost magically, when I stopped talking, when I simply watched and waited, he calmed. He would tilt his head, blink, and eventually come close enough to nuzzle my hand. As if acknowledging the silent pact between us, it became a game one I hadn't realized was shaping the way I viewed people, not just animals. I noticed how Max would test my patience. He would push boundaries, demand attention, and yet, when I remained steadfastly quiet, he learned, gradually, what worked and what didn't, and in those quiet moments, I began to understand something about myself. I was capable of holding space. I could let the noise exist without being pulled into it. School, too, was a place where I learned the value of silence. I wasn't the loudest girl in class. I didn't need to be. While other children clamored for attention, raising their hands, shouting answers, or gossiping in corners, I observed. I watched. I noticed patterns: who got upset when ignored, who tried harder to be included, who grew frustrated, and who retreated quietly. By the time I reached 4th grade, I had a subtle understanding that people, much like Max, often behaved in ways designed to elicit reactions, and those reactions could be controlled not by raising my voice, not by arguing, but by simply choosing when to respond. By the time I was 10, this wasn't just a lesson. It had become a part of who I was. I found that ignoring certain provocations often led people to rethink their behavior. Friends who teased me, classmates who tried to bait me into arguments, even teachers who sometimes displayed impatience. I learned which battles were worth engaging and which were better left unacknowledged. It was a quiet kind of power, subtle but undeniable, and it made me feel safe in a world that often felt unpredictable. Looking back, it's strange how a simple lesson about a dog could shape the way I would navigate human relationships later in life. Silence wasn't about weakness. It was about strategy. It wasn't about giving up. It was about preserving energy and choosing the right moment to assert oneself. Max never knew he was teaching me more than obedience. My parents never knew that a lesson meant for a dog would lay the foundation for how I would deal with frustration, anger, and conflict in the years to come. And yet, as I grew, I realized that not everyone saw it this way. Some people were impatient with silence. They wanted immediate responses, explanations, reactions. They didn't understand that by remaining quiet, I was not indifferent. I was observing, calculating, preparing. And this would later be tested in ways I couldn't yet imagine. When human emotions far more volatile than any dog entered the equation. By the time I reached middle school, the world seemed both smaller and infinitely more complicated. The lessons I had learned from Max, from watching him bark and calm under the patient power of silence, had become instinctive. I noticed that some classmates thrived on drama, on conflict, on the noise of attention. They yelled, they teased, they competed for recognition, and much like Max, they often expected a reaction. It started with small things. A group project where one boy tried to dominate the conversation, raising his voice so everyone would notice his ideas. At first, I used to argue back, trying to assert my own voice. But it never worked. He just got louder, more insistent, more aggressive. Then I remembered Max. I remembered how patience and quiet could teach lessons louder than any words. So I stopped. I listened, nodded occasionally, but I did not respond to the bait. Slowly, I noticed him calming, learning that yelling didn't automatically win attention from me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to others. But I knew I had gained a small victory. And then there was him, my first real boyfriend. He was charismatic, loud, and, to my adolescent self, infuriatingly persistent. He had a habit of yelling when frustrated, when things didn't go his way, or when he simply wanted to be heard. At first, I tried to argue with him. I tried to explain calmly why I disagreed, but it only fueled the fire. The louder he became, the more I realized that talking back was futile. It was like trying to reason with a storm. You could shout, plead, or gesture, but the wind would blow regardless. One day, after yet another shouting match over something trivial he wanted, to spend the weekend with friends instead of helping me with a school project, stopped mid. I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. I simply turned away and focused on my notebook. The silence was complete, heavy, almost tangible. At first, he continued yelling, trying to force a reaction. But gradually, his voice faltered. He stopped, looked at me, confusion crossing his features. "Why aren't you answering me?" he finally asked, voice quieter, tinged with frustration. And that was when it clicked for him. If he wanted me to engage, to really hear him, he had to speak without anger, without yelling. It wasn't a lesson in submission, it was a lesson in communication. The realization dawned slowly, painfully, but it stuck. From then on, our arguments, while not perfect, carried a new rhythm. When tempers flared, I remained silent until he composed himself. Eventually, our disagreements became discussions, and discussions became understanding. Of course, middle school love is fragile. Despite the lessons learned, our relationship didn't last. Teenagers are impulsive, inexperienced, and often too stubborn to see beyond their own desires. But even after we parted ways, the strategy of silence stayed with me. It became a part of my toolkit, not a weapon in the traditional sense, but a shield, a compass, and sometimes a mirror. I had learned to wield it not to hurt, but to teach, to guide, and to preserve my own emotional equilibrium. It wasn't just romantic relationships where this applied. Friendships, too, revealed the power of silent observation. I watched how friends reacted when ignored, how they adjusted their behaviors, and how patience often won more than confrontation ever could. I became quietly respected, even feared in subtle ways, not because I was mean, but because I was impossible to provoke. People learned that my attention and responses were earned, not demanded. Yet, there was a subtle danger in this. Some called it manipulation, though I never saw it that way. To me, it was a method, a skill, a survival tactic in a world where emotions could spiral uncontrollably. I knew the difference between cruelty and strategy, but not everyone else did. That tension, the fine line between influence and coercion, would follow me into high school, into first loves, and eventually, into adult relationships. By the time I walked into high school, I had a reputation. Quiet, intelligent, observant, and sometimes frustratingly unyielding. Teachers liked me. Peers respected me. But any attempt to yell or provoke me was met with the same calm silence that had tamed Max years ago. I had discovered that silence was not absence. Silence was presence, control, and sometimes the loudest voice in the room. Asterisk. By the time I entered college, I had perfected the art of silence. It wasn't something I consciously boasted about. It was instinctive, almost reflexive. I had learned to read people, to observe without immediately reacting, to discern when a voice demanded attention and when it sought only to provoke. Then I met him, Michael. He was nothing like my middle school boyfriend. Yet in ways that mattered, he triggered the same instincts in me. He was smart, charismatic, and occasionally volatile, not malicious, just deeply passionate. In the beginning, we were swept up in the excitement of discovery. Late-night conversations about philosophy, music, dreams. Spontaneous road trips. Laughter that seemed to echo endlessly through quiet apartments. But as familiarity grew, so did tension. Small disagreements would quickly escalate. He had a habit of raising his voice when frustrated about money, plans, or even something as trivial as where to eat dinner. And every time I remembered my younger self, remembered Max, remembered the teenage arguments that had shaped me, I stopped responding. Not because I was indifferent, but because I knew that responding would feed the fire. I let him speak. I let the silence linger, thick and palpable. At first he was confused. "Why won't you answer me?" he demanded one evening after a minor spat about scheduling conflicts. My silence stretched between us like an invisible wall. Finally, he stopped, realizing that the shouting wasn't producing results. Slowly, almost painfully, he learned to speak calmly if he wanted to be heard. This pattern repeated itself often, and our relationship became a complex dance of expression and restraint. My silence was not cruelty. It was a guide. It was a way of saying, without words, "This is how you get my attention. This is how you communicate with me effectively." And in many ways, it worked. Arguments became less explosive, more focused on solutions rather than emotion-fueled noise. Yet, despite the effectiveness of the tactic, there were limits. Michael occasionally expressed frustration at being controlled or taught. "You can't train people like pets," he would say, sometimes exasperated, sometimes amused. "I have a right to be upset, to yell, to vent. That's normal." And he was right, in his own way. Relationships are not laboratories. People are not experiments. But I had learned that human behavior, much like a dog's, often responded to consistency and calm. As our relationship deepened, I became increasingly aware of the dual nature of my silence. It was a tool, yes, but also a mirror, reflecting not only the other person's behavior, but my own. Each time I withheld a reaction, each time I resisted the urge to respond emotionally, I discovered more about myself, my boundaries, my patience, my thresholds for irritation and compassion. But there were costs. Not every person responds well to silence. Some see it as coldness, indifference, or manipulation. Michael sometimes accused me of the latter, though I knew my intentions were never to harm. I had to balance the instinct to remain quiet with the need to be present, to communicate that my silence was not rejection but guidance. The challenges weren't just interpersonal, they were internal. Silence could easily become a shield, a way to avoid difficult conversations or suppress emotions that needed expression. I had to remind myself constantly, silence is powerful, but it is not a cure. Relationships, especially serious ones, require dialogue, compromise, vulnerability. A delicate dance unfolded, one where I learned when to speak, when to listen, and when to simply wait. Looking back on those early adult years, I see now how formative they were. I had transitioned from a child learning from a dog to a teenager navigating first love, and now to a young adult negotiating the complexities of a serious relationship. My strategy had evolved, but the core lesson remained. Patience, observation, and measured response often yield more than immediate reaction. And yet, I knew that life would challenge this lesson further. Real human emotion is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes unresponsive to logic or strategy. The path ahead would test not only my skills, but my understanding of love, empathy, and trust. Silence had given me control, but it had also taught me humility, the understanding that, ultimately, some things cannot be managed, only experienced. Entering my late 20s, I thought I had mastered the art of silence. It had become second nature, a reflex honed over years of observation, trial, and error. But life, I quickly learned, had a way of testing even the most refined skills. I met David at a small cafe on a rainy afternoon. He was reading a worn copy of The Great Gatsby, his coffee half drunk, glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. There was something magnetic about him, not the kind that demands attention with volume or theatrics, but a subtle presence, the kind that draws people in without trying. We started talking about books, the rain, life, and before I knew it, hours had passed. There was an ease, a warmth, an unspoken understanding. In the early months, our connection felt effortless. We shared jokes, cooked meals together, and explored the city's hidden corners. But the real test of any relationship isn't in shared laughter or cozy night sits in conflict. In the moments when ideals clash and emotions rise, it started small, a missed text, a forgotten errand, a difference in weekend plans. David, unlike my previous partners, had a softer temper, but he could still raise his voice when frustrated. I noticed the familiar stirrings of tension, the words, the frustration, the expectation of an immediate response. I felt the old instinct kick in. Don't react, don't feed the fire, wait, the first time it happened. I was startled by how automatic it was. David was speaking, slightly louder than necessary, his frustration clear. My initial impulse was to defend myself, to explain, to justify my perspective. But instead, I stayed quiet. I looked away, focused on my hands, on a point on the floor, letting the silence settle between us like a heavy curtain. At first, David seemed confused. His brows furrowed, his voice dipped slightly, unsure. He paused. "Why aren't you answering me?" he asked, not in anger, but in genuine curiosity. I remained quiet, and the tension lingered. Then, slowly, he lowered his voice, realizing that shouting would not get the response he wanted. He began speaking more calmly, more deliberately, and the argument shifted less about volume, more about content. It was the same pattern I had used before, yet this time it felt different. David wasn't a storm to weather, or a classmate to teach a lesson. He was someone I cared deeply about, someone whose emotions mattered to me. The silence I wielded had to balance guidance with empathy. Too much, and it could hurt. Too little, and the old chaos could resurface. Over time, our arguments became a test of patience and understanding. I found myself teaching, almost without words, how to communicate effectively. And yet, I also learned sometimes the lesson was mine. Silence exposed my own fears, my boundaries, my limits. I had to confront why certain triggers pushed me to withdraw, why certain tones set off alarms in my mind, and then came the moment I dreaded, a confrontation that didn't respond to silence. We disagreed on something significant: financial planning, career decisions, life priorities. David's frustration escalated, his voice trembling with emotion, and this time my silence didn't calm the storm. He waited, puzzled, then accused me of manipulating him. "You can't just ignore me when I'm upset," he said. "That's not fair. That's not love." I felt the tension of years of habit clash with the reality of intimacy. Silence was powerful, but it was not infallible. I realized that while it could shape behavior, it could not replace conversation, empathy, or mutual understanding. That night, we didn't resolve everything, but we laid the groundwork for learning, to recognize triggers, to respect emotions, and to balance strategy with genuine connection. By the end of that week, our relationship had shifted subtly but profoundly. I was still silent at times, but now it was paired with reflection, with explanation, with moments of vulnerability. David learned not just to moderate his volume, but to anticipate my reactions, to understand my patterns. And I learned that silence, while potent, must be wielded with care in matters of the heart. It was a Saturday evening when the tension finally came to a head. We had been arguing over something that, in retrospect, was trivial: how to split responsibilities for an upcoming move, whether to involve friends in the planning, and how much of our personal time should be compromised. But emotions, once stirred, rarely follow logic. David's voice rose, not with anger aimed at me, but with frustration at the situation. He was exhausted, I was stressed, and the small cracks in our communication had widened. As he spoke, I felt the familiar pull of instinct. My throat tightened, my mind screamed to defend myself, but my body remained still. I looked down, focusing on my fingers intertwined in my lap. The silence stretched between us, dense, almost oppressive. David paused mid-sentence, confusion flickering across his face. "Why aren't you saying anything?" he demanded, his voice slightly trembling. I remained quiet, letting the moment linger. This was not the playful, instructive silence of my past. This was the heavier, more consequential silence that carried the weight of real feelings. David's frustration escalated, and for the first time, I saw doubts shadow his eyes. "You're manipulating me," he said softly but firmly. You always do this, talking when you're upset. That's not fair. That's not how relationships work. Hearing the words hurt, not because they were untrue, but because I had never intended them to feel like punishment. My silence had always been a tool, a guide, a way to steer conversation toward calm understanding. I wanted him to learn, yes, but I also wanted us to connect, to resolve issues without chaos. And now I realized the lesson was incomplete. Silence alone could not bridge the gap between two hearts. For hours, we spoke finally, not in raised voices, but in careful, deliberate sentences. I explained why I withdrew in the heat of arguments. It was not rejection, not indifference, not coldness. It was a space to breathe, to calm, to consider. David shared how my silence made him feel powerless, unseen, manipulated. We discovered the fragile balance between control and empathy, between guiding behavior and honoring emotions. It was exhausting, raw, and utterly human. For the first time, I confronted the limitations of my lifelong strategy. Silence could shape behavior, yes, but it could not replace trust, transparency, or emotional honesty. I had learned to wield it like a shield, but it had the potential to hurt if used too rigidly, too mechanically. By the end of the night, we reached a fragile understanding. David agreed to notice when his frustration was clouding his judgment and to approach conflicts with calmer tones. I agreed to pair my silence with explanation to ensure that moments of withdrawal were recognized as reflective, not punitive. In the quiet aftermath, I realized that real, enduring love was less about control and more about balance. This experience became a turning point in our relationship. Arguments no longer ended in lingering tension or confusion. Instead, they became opportunities to explore boundaries, to test patience, and to learn more about each other's inner landscapes. Silence remained a tool in my arsenal, but it was tempered by vulnerability, empathy, and dialogue. And yet, even with progress, the shadow of old habits lingered. Every time David raised his voice, I still felt that primal tug to retreat, to wait, to let silence speak. But now, I paired it with reflection, weighing the moment carefully before deciding whether silence would heal or harm. The lesson I had learned from a small, scrappy dog years ago had evolved into a nuanced understanding of human relationships, delicate, sometimes precarious, but ultimately rewarding dance. By navigating these challenges, I discovered that silence is neither inherently good nor bad. It is only as effective as the intention behind it, as thoughtful as the person wielding it, and as balanced as the mutual respect shared between two people. And in that realization, I found not just the power of patience, but the heart of understanding, the very core of connection. In the weeks following that intense confrontation, David and I found ourselves navigating a new rhythm. The arguments that once left a trail of frustration now became opportunities for dialogue. My silence, once a shield, was tempered with explanation. I would retreat briefly during heated moments, yes, but I would follow it with context, sharing what I needed and what I observed in the heat of tension. David responded in kind. He learned to pause when his voice rose, to articulate his frustration rather than letting it explode unchecked. What emerged was not a perfect relationship, but a partnership rooted in understanding, respect, and patience. I saw clearly that relationships are not contests of will, nor are they arenas for testing control. They are delicate ecosystems where each person's emotional state must be acknowledged, not manipulated. I reflected often on my past, the lessons from Max, the teenage boyfriend, and even the early college experiences with Michael. Each had taught me something essential, but none had prepared me fully for the nuances of adult love, the subtle art of communication, the balance between action and observation, the understanding that silence is not power unless paired with empathy. All of it came together in my relationship with David. One evening, after a particularly productive discussion about our upcoming move, David looked at me thoughtfully. "You've changed the way I see conflict," he said softly. "I used to think arguments were about winning. Now I see they're about understanding." His words struck me deeply. This was the validation of the journey I had undertaken since childhood. Patience, observation, and measured responses could indeed foster understanding, but only when both people were willing to meet halfway in those moments. I realized that silence, when wielded mindfully, was not a weapon but a bridge. It allowed space for reflection, clarity, and growth. And yet, it demanded responsibility. One could not simply withdraw and assume understanding would follow. Emotional honesty and active engagement were essential companions to QUIETUD. As months turned into years, David and I continued to grow together. We faced new challenges, career changes, family pressures, and the inevitable misunderstandings that arise in any long-term relationship. Each challenge was a test of patience, empathy, and communication. And through it all, I remained mindful of the lessons that had shaped me from childhood. The value of silence, the need for observation, and the importance of discernment in responding to provocation. But more importantly, I learned the limits of control. People are not puzzles to solve, nor are relationships laboratories for testing behavior. The power of silence is profound, but it is only effective when used with love and respect. Over time, I realized that my past strategy, if applied too rigidly, could risk creating distance rather than connection. The art of navigating human emotion is in knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to pause, but never with the intent to dominate or manipulate. Looking back, I saw a continuum. The scrappy dog, Max, the teenage arguments, the first college relationship, and now the mature partnership with David. Each stage had refined my understanding, teaching me that the heart is as much about responsiveness as it is about patience. I had learned to use silence wisely, to honor boundaries, and to recognize that love thrives not in control, but in mutual respect. And perhaps the most profound lesson of all was this: true connection is not about winning or teaching, but about being present. Silence, when paired with empathy, becomes a powerful instrument of understanding. When wielded without care, it can isolate. The journey from childhood to adulthood had shown me both sides of that coin, and I emerged with a clearer sense of myself, my values, and my approach to love. Even now, when David and I face moments of tension, I remind myself, silence is not absence, is presence, reflection, and choice. And in that mindful application, I find the heart of connection, the balance between control and freedom, and the enduring strength of patience tempered with compassion. Over time, David and I learned to integrate this understanding into our daily lives. We created a balance, moments of reflective silence, paired with moments of open conversation. We became attentive to each other's triggers, mindful of each other's boundaries, and proactive in fostering trust. Our relationship grew stronger, not because silence was a weapon, but because it was an instrument of clarity and care. I discovered that love is not about controlling behavior or avoiding conflict. It is about understanding, patience, and mutual respect. Silence had shaped me, but empathy had transformed me. I also realized that my journey had lessons far beyond romantic relationships. Friends, colleagues, even casual acquaintances, interaction became a study in human behavior. I observed patterns, recognized triggers, and learned when to engage and when to step back. The art of communication, of listening and observing, had become a guiding principle in all aspects of life. Reflecting on my life, I understood the continuum of lessons, from Max, the dog, to teenage arguments, to first loves, to adult partnerships. Silence was a constant thread, but its meaning had evolved. It was no longer just a tool, but a philosophy and approach to understanding, patience, and connection. The ultimate lesson was simple, yet profound. True connection is not about winning arguments or manipulating behavior. It is about presence, empathy, and thoughtful engagement. Silence can enhance understanding, but it must be paired with clarity, honesty, and mutual respect. Now, as David and I navigate life together, I carry these lessons with me. Each disagreement, each challenge, is an opportunity to apply patience, reflection, and measured response. I have learned that silence, when wielded with care, can bridge gaps, calm storms, and foster growth. But the heart of any relationship, friendship, love, family is always in dialogue, understanding, and shared humanity. In the end, I realized that my journey with silence was never about control. It was about learning to listen to others, to myself, and to the world around me. And that, I believe, is the most enduring and powerful lesson of all.